Welcome back to BeerNid 40K. Today we look at the best models to take for the Genestealer cults against Marine equivalents by looking at the numbers. As you know, if you saw my last Tyrannid video, the numbers don't always tell the whole story, so we'll have to consider other things as well, but my hope is that this helps us all to build stronger cult kill teams and bring glory to the Patriarch. So like this video, subscribe to the BeerNid 40K cult of subscribers, and let's get into it. First, I want to talk about leaders. The fact is, you can only have one leader specialist, but with the Genestealer cults, there are a few extra chances to build and take leader models. You can take models of the Genestealer cult leaders even as non-specialists. The reason you should consider this is that an Acolyte leader and Metamorph leader, they're a bit better in close combat than their normal counterparts for only one more point each. So if you have that 1 point to spare, I would upgrade an Acolyte or Metamorph to a leader model, even if they don't become your leader specialist. These are slightly better in combat than a plain Genestealer and cost a few points less, so if you're squeezed for points towards the end of your list build, consider taking one of these instead. Just keep in mind that the pure strains come with a better save and 2 inches more movement base, so even though the Acolyte leaders and Metamorph leaders are slightly better in combat than a plain Stealer without any upgrades, they aren't necessarily going to be better. Far and away though, the best thing in our faction against MEQs is the Rockalite, so an Acolyte fighter with a rock weapon of some kind. These actually put out more damage than an Aberrant for only 12 points versus the 18 points that it'll cost you for an Aberrant. With all things considered, these things with their instant death rules and ability to generate extra attacks or extra mortal wounds even put out more damage than a Tyrannid Lictor. I know we can't take Lictors in our cults, but I thought the comparison was worth mentioning because it's frankly amazing that a 12-point model can put out more wounds and deaths than something that costs 18 points or 25 points. But the problem is these things are squishy, and you can only take a total of 4 in your whole kill team. So don't write off things like Aberrants or Genestealers just yet, because the simple fact is you cannot make an entire kill team out of all Rockalites. You can take the full 4, but you'll need to consider these other options after you've spammed as many of these as possible, and just make sure you have models to grab objectives. Now I've done some looking, and it seems that the most powerful build in our faction is an Acolyte Fighter Zealot, armed with a Rock Saw. The Rock Cutters, as you know, I love them. They're instant death on a 2-up. They're probably a better choice for regular Acolytes with rock weapons, but the Cutters -1 means that they can't do the Zealot's killing frenzy ability, but the Rock Saws can. So if you're making an Acolyte Fighter Zealot, you might want to consider giving him a Rock Saw instead of the Rock Cutter. However, that is probably the only benefit to the Saw over the Rock Cutter. Yes, the Cutter is -1 to hit, but the special rule means they're killing more than the Rock Saw does at the end of the day. So the Rock Cutter is good, and I don't see the point in spending any extra points on things like the Rock Drill. So the question is, though, if you have a different opinion, I'd love to know about it. But for now, I'm saying basically Rock Cutters all the way, except if you're building a Zealot, perhaps put a Rock Saw on him so that you can do that heavy tactic. On to the subject of Aberrants. The Pix recently got a buff in regular 40k, but not in Kill Team. For only 1 point less than the Hammer, the Pix just do not put out anything close in terms of damage, meaning the Hammer is always going to be the way to go if you're going to take Aberrants in Kill Team at this point. It is unfortunate because I like the looks and theme of the Pix better for my own cult, but the Aberrants with Pix just are not competitive against MEQs for the points that they cost, considering the upfront cost and how much better the whole Aberrant becomes for just 1 more point. So what gives with the Aberrant? Why would you take them at all if a 12-point model is beating them in terms of damage output? Well, there are a few things to them. They have +1 wound, +1 toughness, they have bestial vigor, reducing wounds by 1 to a minimum of 1. So in a faction as squishy as the cults, there really is some value to this survivability. However, you're definitely paying a premium for it, and things like plasma or rail rifles don't mind that extra toughness at all. So in my opinion, the time to think about taking these is after you've maxed out on all 4 of your Rockalites and the Maw Stealer. The price tag is high, but consider that they're still statistically putting out more damage than a Tyrannid Warrior versus Marines. So in the right situation, these are still potentially viable, just not as much as the Rockalites and Acid Maw Stealer when you factor in cost versus output. Speaking of the Maw Stealer, as I said in the Tyrannid faction Math Hammer video, the Genestealer with Acid Maw is a great value for the points in my estimation. They hurt nearly as much as a Lictor does for 50% of their price, and the Stealers have the best leadership in the cult faction, meaning the Maw Stealer is almost an auto-include for me. These are also the cult's only option for a veteran specialist, which is something we need to talk about. So the pure Genestealers do not have Cult Ambush in Kill Team at this time. However, as a veteran specialist, they have the option for a move or an advance before the game starts for 1 command point because of the veteran specialist ability, Adaptive Tactics. Adaptive Tactics gives this single Genestealer a potential 14-inch advance move before the first initiative phase. This also stacks with take forward positions if you choose that in the scouting phase, adding an additional 8-inch move onto the veteran for no extra cost. So stacking the take forward positions move and the Adaptive Tactics veteran ability gives this one Stealer a potential 22-inch move before the game starts. And if you advance again in the movement phase, that brings the total to as much as 36 inches of potential movement before the end of turn 1. So, is this broken? Is this cheating? Is this cheese? Well, maybe a little, but also absolutely not. I recently had a Tau list blow almost my entire team off the board in one good turn of shooting. So in a lower tier faction like the Genestealer cults, the most we can hope for is balance, even when we are at our cheesiest. Even if you use this movement to get a potential turn 1 charge off, things like the Tau are still probably going to light you up with their for the greater good ability, which lets their friendly models within 6 inches of the model you're charging all shoot Overwatch against this single Stealer. So you need to play the mission and stay smart with these guys. And if you do try to pull this off for a turn 1 charge, just remember to end that pregame movement out of line of sight so that you can deny them the chance to fire Overwatch if you do charge in turn 1. With that said, I think that this single Stealer is the only viable build for a pure strain Genestealer in the Cults faction, and I personally will only be taking the Moss Stealer in my cult list and no other pure Genestealers, unless you tell me an idea that makes me think otherwise. My reason for this is that the 4 Rockalites alone are 48 points, and this Moss Stealer with Toxin Sacs brings the list up to 60 points already. We still don't have anything in the list so far to grab objectives yet, and after things like the Acolyte Leader we already discussed, they basically put out more damage than a regular Stealer for cheaper, so I'd look at taking one of those first. And speaking of grabbing objectives, the Neophytes do this for pretty cheap at only 5 points each. On paper, the fact is, though, they do not look good when used offensively. Any ranged weapons besides the demolition charges in all of the Genestealer cults, they just do not look like they're going to get their points back when fighting against an MEQ list. I've run the math with them as specialists, non-specialists, long range, short range, on and on for the past 4 days, but the Neophyte hybrids do not provide reliable range damage versus MEQs, which is sad because many people are starting with a bunch of Neophytes in Kill Team, since that's what came in the starter box. But they are cheap, and that in itself is a buff. They go for objectives, they can carry cult icons, so don't write them off completely. There are some things that math just doesn't account for, so you might just find a use for them that I don't see yet. So cult icons, they give anybody within 6 inches the ability to reroll hit rolls of 1. And since we are definitely a faction that is optimized for close combat, this is an important thing to consider. Yes, it is expensive, but the fact is, hey, like I said, we're a close combat faction, and we need to be as strong at this as possible. You're going to take a lot of casualties and wounds moving in under fire, and you can't afford to be nerfed to hell and back by the time you close in. So this means the Neophytes might not contribute much to the fight with their own attacks, but if you can get them to buff your stronger guys with the icon, they can do something positive for your force. So the good news is, if you can't afford to take an icon, well, the models we've talked about, the Moss Stealer, the Rockalites, the Aberrants with hammers, they're pretty much statistically guaranteed to kill Marines every turn that they're in combat with them. So the icon buffs are much less important in an elite list using only those types of models than they are in a list where you're using less killy dudes. So just ask yourself, are you trying to spam a lot of guys that do less damage? Because in that case, you really should consider an icon to buff them in combat. But if you're running an A-team kind of list, an elite kind of list, something like 4 Rockalites, a Moss Stealer, and 2 Hammerants, well, you don't really have the points to bring icons at that point. And you won't benefit from them as much as a team of cheaper guys would. So, and one last thing, speaking of buffs, Medic Specialist Neophytes have value too. They have the Stim Shot ability giving +1 to charge and advance rolls and +1 to attack for the round. This is great on anything, but even better on Rockalites. The Zealot especially just becomes overkill. But the thing to remember with these is that the medics do this tactic at the start of the movement phase, which means they need to end their movement within 2 inches of the model they want to buff next turn. So with these medics and things like cult icons, you really need to remember to move them last in the movement phase so you can try to get them into a position where the buffs go off or can be activated legally. And lastly, I wanted to talk about the blasting charges. These things are the most powerful shooting in our faction, but it is a situational thing, and they take away a Rockalite, our best model to make an Acolyte fighter with blasting charges. The Blastolites put out as many wounds as a Lictor, but they're going to be tough to pull off because of that short 6-inch range. They can only shoot these once, and after that they become the weakest Acolyte build available because they gave up their Rending Claw and the Cult Knife to make the build. So I think the best use for these, if you do want to take one, is holding that coveted center objective, or staying just outside of an area you are pretty sure is going to get messy. You can possibly push him in front of a few readied models and use the decisive shot tactic to shoot first, even if he's not readied and other models are, and even if they have the initiative. He has that tactic that lets him go first. But again, this is really situational, so just weigh the benefits versus cost when deciding to take out one of our most valuable units, the Rockalite, to make one of these. It's also important to note that he can't fire them in a phase where anyone else from your team used grenades either, so he is kind of a big question mark for me right now, despite how amazing he looks on paper. So I hope this helps you with your builds. We've seen that the Rockalites, so the Acolyte fighters with some kind of rock weapon, are probably the best thing in our faction. The Rock Cutters are probably going to be the best choice unless you want the option to get extra attacks with that Zealot Specialist tactic, in which case the Rock Saw might be a better choice on him. Either way, they're all good choices. And we've seen that the best Stealer build is that Veteran with an Acid Maw and Toxin Sacs. We've seen that the Aberrants have pros and cons, but can potentially be worth it if you take hammers on them. We've seen that Neophytes are not competitive unless you're using them for a very specific purpose, to give buffs or hold uncontested objectives. And like we saw with the Tyranid faction, we've seen that the cults just do best as a close combat army. So this is my favorite faction in all of 40k and Kill Team. I really hope this helped you with the Genestealer cults. If you see something differently, I'd love to hear about it in the comments, and if this helped you out, be sure to let me know that too. Don't forget to like and subscribe. This has been Beernid 40k.